All right, we have one more thing to look at with the spoilers example before we move on to another example. And that is a way to be able to perform a function on multiple items. For example, in this case, what if we want to show all spoilers? All right, we could do it individually using getElementById and so forth. But what if we want to show them all? How do we do that? So that's what we'll look at in this part of the example for today. So let me pull this up in Visual Studio Code. You're welcome to use whatever editor you want to for your programming, but I found Visual Studio Code to be very useful and would recommend using it. All right, the guts of this program you should know by far. So far, you know, we have spoilers that are hidden, and we have JavaScript based on the on-click event of certain buttons. It goes and calls the show or hide function and so forth. All right. Now, to show all spoilers on click. This is different because, again, we want to show multiple things. So we're going to use, can't really use getElementById because I guess we could, right? We could pass all the IDs that we wanted to show, but that's kind of clunky. And what if we added another spoiler to the list? We would want that to be included as well. So we're using something different. Instead of getElementById, we're using query selector all. All right. And what that does is that gives me a list, an array of everything that matches what's in the argument for this function based on CSS queries. In other words, how, you know, every spoiler we set to be invisible by saying .spoiler. All right. We can do our query based on that selector if we use the query selector all function. And of course, this could potentially return a list. All right. So that means that we have to loop through the items that we return and process each one of those individually. All right. And that's what we're doing here. So for S of list spoilers, what that means is we're going to loop through for every item that's in this list of spoilers list or array. And each time through the loop, the next item on the list is going to be called S. So the first time through the loop, S is going to be spoiler 1. The second time through the loop, S is going to be spoiler 2. The third time through the loop, S is going to be spoiler 3. And we simply go and call the show spoiler function for each of those based on the ID. Remember, this is giving us an element. This is giving us this paragraph tag. We have to pluck out from that paragraph tag the ID to call this function because this function is expecting an ID. We could have done this a little differently. All right. We could have done something like this. We could have done something like this, but I'm not going to do that. Why? Because that's essentially duplicated code. We already have a function to hide a spoiler. All right. Therefore, I'm going to use that function in this case as well. So it's not like this is horrible, but in a way, we're duplicating functionality. because we already have a function to hide a spoiler. Why would we duplicate the code up here? There's always a chance that hide spoiler could do more than one thing. Like, for example, actually, I lied. It's show spoiler, not hide spoiler. And show spoiler does do more than one thing. It makes the ID visible by setting the display property to block, and it sets the color to blue. So if we just called this function here, we wouldn't do that, change the color to blue. So therefore, everything we want to do when we show a spoiler is contained in this function. We already have that function defined for other things. Therefore, I'm not going to duplicate functionality up here. I'm going to use my function. And that's going to be a theme throughout this class, is creating functions that you can reuse, that you can use in multiple places. I'm thinking ahead to an assignment that we have where we're going to calculate tuition at Lorain Community College. And we're going to create a table, and we're going to create a calculator. And the calculator should use the same functions as the table. That ensures consistency. If there's a change in tuition or there's a bug in tuition and we need to fix it, there needs to be one place that we should go to fix it or to change it. And therefore, we're not going to have separate functions, but I'm getting a little ahead of myself. Now, there's other things other than query selector all. We've already seen get element by ID. There's a get element by tag name. There's a get element by class name. So I could have used get element by class name in this case to do the same thing and to get my list of spoilers, because they all have the same class of spoiler. I could not have used get element by tag name because there's some paragraphs that are not spoilers. I guess I could have, right? Because we'd just make visible what's already visible, and that's not really a problem. But if we try to do the same kind of logic for hiding spoilers, would hide this too if we use get element by tag name. So you have a number of ways to attack and to point to the items on your page, in your document. And they all have their place. And to review them, and there might be more that slip in my memory right now. But there's get element by ID. That is used when you want to point to one specific element on the page, because there shouldn't be any duplicate IDs on a page. So get element by ID. We want to change this specific spoiler and only the spoiler. There's query selector all. That gives us all the items that match the CSS query enclosed in here. So it would give us everything with a class of spoiler. I like this because this is very, very, very flexible. If you think about it, if we're styling things in a certain way, it means that we want consistency, and the things that are all styled the same way, there's a good chance are conceptually the same sort of thing, right? Which would make sense that if we want to do it to one, we might want to do it to all. All right, so that's just a different way of going about getting to that list. I think there's a get query selector that will only return the first one. Query select, let's see, because query selector all. Query selector.
Good question, sir.
Returns the first element that matches the specified selector. I don't know if I'd use that a lot. You know, I guess you could, but I would probably use the ID if I was going after that. But just know that it is available. and there's get element by tag name, get element by class name. These are all ways to either get one element or a list or an array of elements. And if you have the one element, you can just address it directly. If you have a list, you probably want to loop through that and pull up each one individually. And that's exactly what this for next loop does. Loop through this list, one iteration through the loop for every element in this array. And it's going to call each element in the array in turn S. First one, second one, third one, and so forth. I also did something that's very useful in JavaScript programming in this case, is I used the console log statement. That's very useful in debugging JavaScript. So let's say, I'm going to try to make a mistake. Well, never mind. I don't know what a good mistake to be here. But if we look here, I have console log each time through the loop. It's outputting S, and it's outputting the ID of S. So I do console log. So if we look at the JavaScript console, we'll see the output of that. So the first time through the loop, S is, I don't know how well you can see it, but the paragraph tag that has an ID of spoiler 1. And the ID from that is spoiler 1. This is the second element through the loop. Second S value that gets set is the second spoiler that has an ID of spoiler 2, and its ID is spoiler 2, and finally spoiler 3. That allows us to make sure that we're getting the right things we're getting the things that in this case, this was showing me that I was getting the things that I would expect to get through the list. And if it's not working and you put these console logs in, you can see if what you expect to happen is actually happening, which if your code isn't working, what you expect happening is probably not what's actually happening. So it's a very useful debugging tool. All right, I think that's all for this. Let's go on to our next example. So far, we have done mainly stuff with the CSS. We've changed things colors, we have made things visible and invisible, and so on. But there's a lot of other stuff we could do too. All right. And we can actually change the HTML of a page. All right. Remember, we have the triangle that exists between JavaScript, CSS, and HTML. And JavaScript can access and manipulate both the CSS of a page, which we've been doing in the example so far, and it can also manipulate the HTML of a page. So let's look at this example. All right, let's look at it. I have a little example to calculate the gross pay for someone based on certain rules. I have 3 job types: manager, associate, and trainee, and they all get different wage rates. So if I put in that they're an associate and they worked 40 hours, their gross pay is $480, and I display this gigantic green check. All right. If I put in something bogus, like I don't select a job type, or if I put garbage in for hours, I get a little X, little smaller X, must enter a number for hours, and must choose job type. It's going to bug me, so I am going to make this smaller. I probably do this every single semester and then forget about uploading a new version and then have to do it again next semester, but oh well. Set this to be 200. So if I enter in something valid, does a calculation, says it's valid. If I enter something that's invalid, it gives me the red X and it displays as part of an unordered list, a list of all the errors. Keep in mind, and I say this in every class, my examples are just meant to show you certain techniques. I'm not trying to pass these off as aesthetically good looking web pages. They're used to demonstrate certain things that we can do. All right, let's look at the copy of this. The other thing, the other disclaimer here is I will typically put the CSS and JavaScript all in the same file just for convenience of looking. We can talk more about this before, but if you think your function can be reused, you probably want to put it in a separate JavaScript file. And you generally always want to put your CSS in its own file with only rare exceptions. Okay. All right. I have a basic form here, text box for text hours, radio button for the different categories of employees. This is a button and not a submit button because we're not sending this code to the server. We're actually doing this calculation in the browser, in the client. And what triggers this operation is on click of this button. That gets the ball rolling by calling process form. Now, my process form is a very small function. Ideally, you want a function to be contained in one screen's worth of data. Now, this example probably has some that don't, but I'm also showing it at a larger font size, and I put plenty of spaces to increase the readability when projected on a screen. But the process form has a very simple logic to it. We're going to call the validate form function. All right, this function is going to return either a true or false. And so one thing we haven't talked about functions in the previous examples is that functions also have a return value. And the return value is sort of the answer of the question that the function's being asked. So validate form is sort of like asking, is this form valid? Does this form have valid data? And that's a yes or no question. So that answer is going to be a Boolean. So either yes, the form is valid, or no, the form is not valid. true or false. Because this returns a true or false, I can put it right in the middle of an if statement. So we're going to call this function validate form, which is over here. And at the end, I'm returning this be valid variable, which I'm either going to set to true or false. All right, based on certain conditions. All right, if it's true, we want to go ahead and calculate the results. And then display our somewhat smaller green checkbox. Oh, we have a question. Phil? You can either put it in chat or you can ask. I think I can hear you.
Can you hear me now, sir? Hello? Okay.
I'm really not hearing you. Maybe if you could type it in chat. Yeah, I can't hear. We'll wait a second to see if Phil's question pops up. All right, if you do enter the, let's see, did he enter? Can you hear me? No, I can't.
Able to right
Click on the microphone where?
for the mute. I think if you go up to the mute microphone, you can probably right click there. Able to change the speaker.
Presenter. Oh, okay. Yes, should we use ID or class when we want to get elements? I can't give an answer to that question. That it totally depends on the situation. All right. If you know there is one thing on the page and only one thing that you want to change, then you probably would use an ID. If there is a chance that you want to change multiple things, then you would use the class or the CSS query to the list of items. So it really depends on what you want to do. If you want to do something to everything that has a certain class, then you use that. If you want to do something just to one specific item, you probably want to use the ID. All right. So if the form is valid, we calculate results and display our check. If the form is not valid, we display the X. All right. Let's look at validate form.
Sure, I have a question.
Yeah.
It was about you're checking if there's a valid GBG file is right there, but what's the valid for? Is it like to say?
Oh, what's the valid for? That's the alt attribute of it.
Okay.
So you know you should strictly speaking have an alt attribute for all this. And I was a little lazy and I only put the word valid, but you know you could say this check indicates that the form was valid.
That's passed through as a parameter.
Yeah, that's passed as a parameter to display image.
Okay.
And I create the image and I set the alt attribute. This is kind of a long example. We'll probably get through a good part of it today. We might not. I would attempt to, if we don't get through it all entirely today, I would I would review the example out there, and we'll finish up next week. All right, let's look at validate form. Validate form, first thing it does is it clears out the errors. All right. In this example, we're going to output HTML. So we're going to output an unordered list, and we're going to output an image tag. All right. Now, we're doing this two different ways. I'm doing it two different ways to demonstrate the two different ways you can do it. I'll talk about the preferred way of doing it. Why do I do it a way that's not preferred? Well, if you were coming across someone else's code that did it this way, it's important to kind of that you've seen it before. So a lot of times your job is to maintain someone else's programming. So this will introduce you to the other technique of knowing it. But the first thing I do is I set the inner HTML to empty string. That's this errors ID section here. It starts out, of course, empty, but each time I press the button, I want to reset that because I don't want to display the errors over and over and over again. All right. I only want to have one set of errors being displayed, the most common. All right. I set be valid equal to true. I'm going to assume the form is valid until I have reason otherwise, until I know that there's a problem with it. You know, it's easier to find something wrong because something wrong means the whole form is not valid. If I find one wrong thing, the whole form is invalid. If I tried it the other way around, if I assumed the form was not valid, I would have to test a combination and make sure every piece was valid. All right. If you don't believe me, try writing this function assuming that the form is not valid, and you'll see that it's a much more complicated function, much harder function to do. But trust me, it's easier to assume that the form is valid, and we're going to look for a counterexample of where it's not valid. All right, we're going to form an error message, and this error message is going to contain an HTML string of the HTML that we're going to create on the page in the case of an error. So if you notice from this example, the errors are shown in an unordered list. So we're starting off that unordered list here for errors. All right, we grab the value for hours using getElementById. Why do I use getElementById? Because text hours is one thing on the page specifically that I'm looking for. I'm looking for this text box. I want to access this text box. There's not a chance that I want to access this text box and some other text box too. I only want that text box. So therefore, I'm using getElementById. So now I have the value in that hours text box, which could be anything. All right, here I remove any trailing and leading and following spaces. I do that because I want that to work. Even though it's goofy, I don't want to say, hey, that's not a number. So I remove all leading and trailing spaces. If I'm left with nothing after I remove all leading and trailing spaces, then I know that they didn't enter a field. So boom, I got an error. I know I have an error. I set that be valid to false. and I add to my error message, I add to that unordered list an LI saying that you must enter hours. So if I put a bunch of spaces in here, and even if I select a job type, must enter hours. Right? Now, if there's something in there, I do the else. I do it in separate steps because I want to give a precise error message. All right. I have run into so many cases online where I've had to enter a phone number and it just tells me the phone number is invalid and doesn't tell me why it's invalid. So, you know, if I was validating a phone number, first of all, I would probably put on the screen the format I expected the phone number. Do I expect it with dashes? Do I expect it with parentheses? You know, how do I expect it? Do I expect it just to be a string of numbers? All right. But secondly, if there was an error, I would be more specific in the error. So I'm trying to do that here. Because what could be wrong with hours? You could not enter at all. You could enter something not numeric, and you could enter hours of less than 0. So in each case, I have a specific error message for that. So if I type in something that's non-numeric, I get must enter a number for hours. That's what is NaN means, is hours not numeric. Finally, if these two things are valid, if, in other words, if there's something in there and it is a number, I'm testing to make sure if hours is less than 0, because if it's less than 0, then we have an error because you can't work negative 10 hours in a week. Although I have worked with some people that it seemed that they worked 10 hours, negative 10 hours in a week. So we display a specific error message for that. In all cases, if we find a problem, we set that be valid flag to false. Now, there probably is another thing I should check for. I should check for greater than a certain number, right? You know, if this, assuming this is a weekly thing, you couldn't possibly work more than 168 hours, right? 24 hours times 7. That's, yeah, 168, I think. All right. So I probably should check for that, have some upper limit, maybe based on my company's policy, maybe 80 hours a week is the maximum that someone can work, or whatever the maximum was. So I probably should check for that. That would be a good exercise in this case, is to take this and add that extra validation on it to make sure that the hours are not greater than a certain value. And again, this could be done several different ways. This is just the way that I chose to do it. So the bottom line is, if we've made it to this point, we have tested the hours completely. And either everything's okay with the hours, which means it's valid, or there's a problem. And if there's a problem, then be valid has been changed to false. So now we're going to start looking at the type. And I've written a get type function. All right. Did I have to do that? Probably not, but it's good practice to break things down into functions. And in this case, I have a radio button. And I'll tell you, in the old days, this statement didn't work, but it does work now. So in the past, you would have had to do something like this. The value of the radio button equals find the first thing that has a name of RB type, and return its value. I really didn't have to put this in a function, but I did. We have a similar validation for that. If the type is nothing, then it's not valid. And the error message is you must choose job type. Notice what I'm doing every time I find an error. I'm taking the error message that was there before, in that case, the UL tag, the start UL tag, and I'm concatenating an LI tag, a complete LI tag that has the starting tag, the text, and the ending tag. So I'm concatenating it onto what the list was before. So if this is the error, my error message now would have the start UL tag plus the LI tag that said must enter hours. If I find a problem with this, I take and I concatenate this error message to my error message. I finish up my unordered list because that's all I'm going to check for, is that the type is not equal to, that the type, if the type is equal to an empty string. All right. I don't really have to worry about trim now because they're not typing in the value. The value is the value of the options, and that is coded as an empty string. And if there is an error, I display the error message. I set the inner HTML of the section called errors to my UL tag, which now, if it's invalid, that UL tag has a starting UL tag. It has maybe an LI for numbers, or maybe an LI for job type. But if B valid is false, then it has at least one of those. It might have both. And then I've closed the error message here. And I set the inner HTML of errors to the error message. Now, again, let's say that, close your eyes for a second, everyone. I'm going to make a mistake here. Oh, that wasn't horrible. I thought it would be, I thought more would happen. Well, I guess this is wrong. How come that's not part of the list? How come that is not a list item? It's not indented. Well, I don't know. Let's go, and actually I do know because I made that error, but let's write to the console the error message. And I can take a look at what's in there, and I know it needs to be a valid UL tag. I could go to the console then. And I can see the actual LI tag. And if I look at this closely, I can see that there's no greater than sign after the UL. Oh, that's what I messed up. I would suggest before you put something in production, remove all the console logs, or at least comment them out. So that takes us through the validate form function. I'm going to at least start the display image. And we'll probably review this again next time. So I call the display image if it's not valid. I also call the display image if it is valid. And I give it two arguments. I give the image name and I give the alt text for the image that I misspelled. All right. So we'll come to calculate results. We'll look at that one next time. That's actually a pretty simple one. Let's look at that now. Maybe we'll save display images for next time. Calculate results is pretty straightforward. All right. I have a get type function that we've shown that one before that grabs the type of employee they are. I have a get rate function, which is a function of the type. So if they are a manager, they get $15 an hour. If they are an associate, they get $12 an hour. If they're a trainee, they get $10 an hour. However, associates and trainees get paid overtime. So their gross pay equals hours times rate to start out. However, if they are an associate or they are a trainee, and this two vertical lines is the or function, that means that this big condition will be true if either of the little conditions is true. And if hours are greater than 40, then they get an extra half their rate for all the hours over 40. So essentially they get paid time and a half for any hours over 40. And so the gross pay now is the gross pay plus overtime. All right. And then we simply display in the inner HTML a result over here, span, the gross pay. All right, pretty straightforward. That leaves us with the display image function. And we'll look at that next time. This is the better way to create HTML on a page, because this gives us objects that we can later on possibly point to and reference. So this gives us, this is a more proper way of doing it instead of putting a string out there. If I put a string out there, I'm likely to, or there's a chance at least that I'll get that string wrong. Remember, you define a string, it doesn't have to be a tag, it could be anything, right? I want it to be a tag, but there's no checking to make sure that I put a tag in there. There's no compiling or anything like that that's going to verify, hey, this HTML, is that valid HTML? Who knows? It's whatever I put in the string. We've seen an example a few minutes ago of I didn't have valid HTML in here. This method will ensure that you have valid HTML, and it will have objects that you can reference and so on. We'll pick up on this one next time. So if you get a chance, review this, see if it makes sense to you. And we'll start here next time. Are there any questions? All right, we will either see you over in lab or we will see you next week. Take care.